So in prairies like this and in Minnesota, historically these prairies would have burned every 1 to 5 years. And rather than being some destructive force that kills plants, it's actually a rejuvenating force. After fire, plants spring to life, everything greens up very quickly, plants reproduce like crazy. They are adapted to fire, they're used to fire, and without fire, they suffer.
Team Echinacea! Hi guys, this is Miss Wicker. Welcome to the prairies of western Minnesota, where I'm here working with the Echinacea project. Today we're going to talk to Jared a little bit about his project looking into the effect of fire on the prairies here. So we're going to go out and head on to the Stephenson Prairie Preserve and talk to Jared.
How fire influences plant reproduction and population growth in fragmented tallgrass prairies. So fire was a really important part of many ecosystems in North America, way down in Florida, all the way into the Great Plains, and here in western Minnesota, we had really expansive grasslands that probably burned every 1 to 5 years. But over the past 200 years, most of these grasslands haven't experienced fire. They're small and isolated, and a lot of plants are having a hard time. They're not reproducing very well, and many plants are going extinct. We know fire helps, but we don't necessarily know why fire helps. And so our goal is to try to understand what role fire plays in helping plant populations grow and persist. I think my advice for anyone who's struggling to come up with a research question is to go out for a walk, whether it's in a local park, whether it's out in a little natural area, and just make observations and ask questions. No little observation is too small to start a really interesting research question. Before starting this research project, I did a lot of research to understand what we know about fire and what role fire plays in prairies and other ecosystems. And there's been a lot of research on it, but we don't know a lot about how fire influences plant reproduction or how fire might prevent plant populations from going extinct. And there was also research to understand, like, how do you safely and effectively conduct prescribed burns? So we hypothesized that fire helps plant populations grow and persist by improving reproduction. And specifically, after fire, we expected that plants were going to flower like crazy. And because there are more flowers on the landscape, pollinators are going to be more attracted and they're going to move pollen more efficiently between different plants, which leads to better pollination and greater seed production. When we were designing our experiment to understand how fire influences plant reproduction and population growth, we were really careful to look at a bunch of different prairie remnants, prairie areas that had never been plowed or cultivated. And what we did is we were really deliberate about selecting prairies that were different sizes, had different numbers of plants, and allowing us to compare prairies that burned to prairies that didn't burn, to have this nice comparison between a burn treatment and a control treatment, so that we can understand exactly what effect fire is having on these plants. We faced a lot of different challenges when we were setting up this experiment. For one, safely conducting prescribed burns takes a lot of preparation and a lot of effort. So we needed to contact landowners, we needed to make sure that we had a plan in place so that we knew exactly what we were doing on the day of a burn. And then we had to wait for the right weather, because you have to burn in conditions that are safe. The temperature isn't too high, it's not too dry, so that the fire is going to stay within the area that we want it to stay within. So we had to be patient, wait for the right weather, and now as we're collecting data on the plants, it's a big, huge effort, and we have a big team helping us out. And so it's always a challenge to stay organized and to make sure that we're collecting good data so we have great information about how fire is influencing these prairie plants. Once we've collected all of this data about how plants are responding to fire, our next job is to analyze that data to make sure that the patterns that we're seeing are quantified with numbers. And so our first step, once we collect all that data and make sure that that data is of good quality, is we make a graph. So in our experiment, we have an independent and a dependent variable that we're interested in. The independent variable, or like the causal variable, is our burn treatment. So we have prairies that burned and prairies that didn't burn. And for our dependent variable, go on your y-axis, you could say seed production. And so in other words, we want to understand how the seed production of prairie plants depends on whether they burn or didn't burn. So in a big, long study we conducted here at Stephenson Prairie Preserve, we found that fire improved seed production and reproduction in prairie plants like our purple coneflower by increasing the number of plants that were flowering, improving pollination, and promoting greater seed production. So this led to a number of different questions. One was, all right, we know exactly what's happening here at Stephenson. How might fire influence prairies that are smaller or larger? Does fire have the same effect across all populations and all plant species? Or might fire have different effects in different places? And so we did this experiment to look at fire effects across 30 different prairies all across this area. So we know that fire is important in ecosystems all across the world, from back in Florida where you're from to over here in Minnesota. We know that fire plays a really important role in a lot of different ecosystems. And we know that without fire, a lot of plant and animal populations have trouble, sometimes even going extinct. And what our research shows is it reveals one of the important ways that fire helps out plant populations. It improves reproduction, and plants need to successfully reproduce to persist in prairies and other ecosystems worldwide long term. Once we finished conducting our study and we had analyzed our data, it was time to share our results. And so we did this by writing a paper that was reviewed by other scientists to make sure that the data that we collected and presented were of sufficient quality. But we also shared our results with a broader audience by presenting at scientific conferences, by presenting information to members of the general public who are interested in prairies and fire. And it's really important to share our findings because as scientists, we're driven by curiosity. We want to know exactly what's going on in the world. And once we learn what's happening, it's a really satisfying feeling. But if we don't share what we've learned with other scientists, we can't improve our knowledge overall.
Thank you for telling us all about the fire here, Jared, and for showing us how your project followed the steps of the scientific method. I think it's really cool that while so many think of fire as this destructive thing, in so many ecosystems, it's actually a life force that helps plants thrive in the area. Thank you, Jared, for telling us all about it.